Now I get to introduce Austin Hazlehurst. We got two awesome Austins in this network, and it's always great to have them side by side. Austin is the Senior Finance and Agrivoltaics Analyst with Hyperion Systems, a community scale solar developer based in Massachusetts. So I'll let Austin talk to us in depth about solar models, business, and tax credit stuff. So it'll be fun. Thank you, Austin.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to talk to y'all and learn from y'all. I was getting really excited to hear our intros. They're such a diverse group, and I'll be able to learn a lot from all of you as well. So I'm excited for this to be a dialogue. And to that end, please, if you have questions, I'm very low key. Please interrupt me and ask a question as we go. I want this to be very free form, feel very conversational. But like Alexa said, I'm here to talk to you about a lot of the financial aspects of agrivoltaics and solar. That's because I'm a financial analyst by trade, financial modeler by trade, and you might have been guessed from just looking at me, but I'm not a farmer or a rancher myself. I come from the solar side of things. I started working in the industry back in 2020, and in 2023, I started working in agrivoltaics full time. I have even some people in this room, including former professor of mine, Dr. Busolo, to thank for bringing me up in my agrivoltaics career. One of those other people is Larimer, who you've heard mentioned several times, Jack Solar Garden. And so when I was working in my conventional solar industry doing projects that were utility scale, often 1,000+ acres of solar panels that were unfortunately taking a lot of farmland out of production. I was also learning about agrivoltaics at the same time from Byron. I had an epiphany on a solar site that I was touring where it had been converted farmland over 1,000+ acres, and seeing that in person, realized that me getting into the solar industry to try to do a net good for the world didn't feel like I was doing that good anymore. I felt like I was providing a clean energy solution at the expense of a food viability problem, farm viability problem, soil health problem. And that's when it really hit me that I think agrivoltaics is the way that we should be developing these projects whenever we can. And that's when I took my personal journey to getting into this space. So that's enough about me, though. Let's get into some of the solar aspects here. So, and actually, I'm going to blaze through these because this would just be redundant. Jordan did a great job covering these in his slides, talking about different mounting types of solar. The one thing I will add is just let's think about how the shading might be different amongst these solar arrays. So if I go back here to this fixed tilt array, you can see that the shade is cast right under these solar panels here. That's because they are running east to west rows. And so you're going to have essentially strips of your land that is going to be in full sun and full shade throughout the season. Whereas if you start orienting these north to south instead of east to west, like this vertical bifacial array, you'll actually get partial shading across the entire solar array. And that is similar to single axis tracking. In fact, here's a time lapse of Jack Solar Garden actually to show you what that looks like throughout the day. So in this view, we're looking north right now along the rows of solar panels. And you can see that in the early morning, these solar panels tilt as far as they can to the east, and they track towards the west to follow the sun throughout the day. You can see that that shadow they cast behind them is swiveling through the solar array at the same time. And so that's what I mean when I say every part is getting partial shading. There's going to be no one part in full sun or full shade. However, every single portion of the site will get some level of shade at some point during the day. So that's a consideration to make as you are thinking about what makes sense for your operation. But now let's get into some of the boring stuff, some of the meat and potatoes about solar. There are several different business models or ways you can distribute and sell electricity. Here is a table. I know this is very busy. Don't worry, we'll break this down step by step. On the far left here, one of the most common things for solar on smaller scales is what's called behind the meter. And that's just fancy words for essentially meaning you're using all of the solar on site. So you're not connected to the electric grid, you're using all of your energy on site. This means that the way that you make money on this is you're not actually selling your electricity anywhere. You're actually saving on your energy bill. So you're paying the upfront cost of the solar system, and you're hopefully eliminating or very significantly reducing your electric bill, and that's how it's valued to you. The next column over is net metering, which is very similar. It's intended to essentially be used all on site. However, the difference is you are now connected to the electric grid, and any excess electricity you use or any electricity that you have generated above what your actual usage is can actually be sold to the grid for some amount of money. However, it's intended to be sized to how much you use on site. So both behind the meter and net metering installations tend to be very small. It tends to lend themselves better towards rooftop style installations or ground mounts that are smaller than 1 acre. On the community solar side, this is where we're starting to get into the realm of where you're selling all of your electricity to the grid. And so for community solar, you're actually, if you own this solar project, you're going out in the community, you're finding homeowners, business owners, maybe even the local government. You're essentially selling shares of your solar production. It works very similarly to a CSA, only you're selling electricity instead of crops. But essentially you are going and finding people subscribe to your solar array throughout its lifetime. So these start getting a little bit bigger because there's more than whatever your on-site usage is. By rule in Colorado, it has to be less than 10 megawatts, which is approximately 50 acres or so. However, I'd say most solar arrays in this size can be between 5 and 25 acres, generally speaking, in the state. And then we have power purchase agreements. So this is where you're starting to get into what is called utility scale solar, but this is where you are still selling all your electricity to the grid, but rather than going and finding all your subscribers and going actually in the community and finding customers, you're selling directly to the utility. So this one is where the reason the projects start getting really big is that now you're selling at the wholesale rate. So the utility can buy the electricity from you, and they flip it and sell it to ratepayers at a retail rate. And because that wholesale rate is so much smaller than the retail rate, which all of these other three programs are ultimately a function of, that means that you have to start getting really large and getting economies of scale to bring the cost of that system down. So I have on the slide here that's greater than 10 megawatts, greater than 50 acres. In reality, you're getting into the hundreds of acres, usually 500 plus, even well over 1,000 acres sometimes to do that. So both community solar and power purchase agreements tend to use a lot of ground mounts. That single axis tracking system that Jordan was showing earlier, that time lapse is probably the industry standard design today. It has the best bang for your buck, if you will, for generation compared to the cost of all the moving pieces to make those solar panels move. So if you're a landowner, how many landowners are in the room, by the way? Excellent. Okay, great. So if you're a landowner, there are a couple different ways you can participate in a solar array. You can either lease the land to the solar company and they pay you for using that land, but they're responsible for selling the electricity and maintaining the system, or you can own the system yourself where you're selling the electricity and maintaining the system. So here's some numbers here from what I've seen in my experience here in Colorado. Also, I recognize these are very wide ranges and I'll explain what that is, but it really depends on which of those four business models we talked about that you're in and the scale you're operating on to dictate where you fall within this range. But in general, let's look at the lease scenario. There's no upfront cost to you of doing the lease. Lease rates in Colorado are anywhere from $350 to $2,000 per acre per year. On the next slide, I'll break down what scales tend to associate with which part of those ranges. But in general, these are very low risk ways to be involved. Of course, you still have the risk of will the project go forward, get all the approvals it needs. But once that project goes forward, you're not responsible for very much at all. You're mostly just collecting your paycheck. So your payback period is essentially instantaneous at that point because you've put no upfront money down and you're collecting that steady revenue stream through the lease payments over time. If you're going to own the system, however, you can see there's a very large upfront cost of these systems. Solar arrays cost a lot of money and operate for a long time and have a very slow and steady long-term business model. And so the upfront cost is anywhere from $200,000 to about $1 million per acre. And I know that's a very wide range. What I'll tell you is that if you're going to be grazing animals or not going very tall, for example, doing something that closely resembles a standard solar installation, I'd say you're probably somewhere between $250,000 to about $450,000 per acre for your upfront installation costs. However, if you're going to be doing this over an orchard like what we've seen today and what we'll talk about the Talbot farm, that's where you start getting upwards of $1 million an acre for these installations that are 14 plus feet tall. Those are very, very expensive installations. And then you can see that with the revenue, they're, like I said, slowly chipping away at that over time. Sale prices for electricity here in Colorado are anywhere from about 4 cents a kilowatt hour to maybe 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that earns you about $24,000 to $60,000 per acre per year. And so it takes quite a long time for these projects to pay back for themselves. Usually the ones that are economic and go forward, it takes about 5 to 12 years for those to pay back for themselves. And if you're owning this yourself, you have a lot more responsibility and therefore a lot more risk about actually going to work with the Excels on the utilities and get the approvals for that, doing the permitting approvals, financing the project, building the project, and then maintaining it once it's operational. So as promised with those lease rates, with these different business models, here are kind of the ranges I've seen in Colorado for projects like this. With behind the meter and net metering, again, the way you're making money is by offsetting your own electricity bill. So the leasing situation doesn't really make sense. You kind of have to own those systems for the economics to work out there. For community solar, that's where you're a little bit towards the upper end of that range. I've seen anywhere from $500 to $2,000 per acre per year. About 1,000 has been pretty typical to what I've seen. Although Angie, you could probably speak to this even better than I can, but Colorado's updated their community solar program, which is not quite as lucrative as it was before. So I'd say even haircut that $1,000 an acre a little bit for what a market lease rate would be today. And then if you're going to the very large scale solar systems of utility scale, hundreds of acres, I've seen anyone from $350 to $1,250 per acre per year, where about 700 is typical. And I'd say that that market's not been impacted by those policy changes like community solar has. So I'd say those rates are probably pretty typical today too. So I've done this presentation a handful of times now, and the number one thing I hear from landowners is that we don't know what we can ask for, and we're intimidated to ask for things. And I'm here to tell you that you have a lot of traction to be able to advocate for yourself. And so please don't be afraid. It's better to ask than it is to sit quiet. And in general, here are some tips for maybe guiding some of those things you might ask for. The biggest tip I have for you is know what your goal is, know what your vision is. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but know, are you trying to simply offset the property taxes on your land with this lease payment that you're receiving from solar? Or are you trying to do something bigger, like maybe make a college fund for the next generation or a retirement plan for yourself? Whatever that answer is, it's important to know that and be oriented in that so that you know ultimately how much money you need to make from this project. Second thing is know which land you're willing to use and which land you're not willing to use. So, it's actually advantageous from the solar developer's perspective to have you set these boundaries literally and figuratively up front, because they want as little uncertainty as possible. They want to know that this project can move forward as streamlined as it possibly can. And so if you're able to cleanly tell them these are areas you can work, these are areas you cannot work, then that's advantageous to all of you. And it doesn't matter ultimately what that reason is, but I know some people have wanted to preserve building lots for maybe another house one day, or for a next of kin to build a house somewhere on the land. I know some people have had family members buried on their land. It's important to make sure that that's defined and that you're not building on that footprint. And ultimately, with the combination of knowing what your goal is and knowing which land you're willing to use and not, that's where you can start to figure out what your baseline economics are. So basically, have a number in your head of how much money do I need to make from this project for this to be worth my time, for it to be worth doing it. But of course, don't negotiate from there. Try to get a little bit more than that and have some cushion. But that way you know that if these solar projects are really tight economically and every partner involved is having to tighten their belt an extra belt loop or so, then you know just how tight you can squeeze yourself to still make this work and still get towards your goal and your vision. And one of the best ways that I've seen, I wouldn't say this is standard, but one of the best ways I've seen to enforce that is having a minimum leased acreage in your lease. So that essentially, if you're getting paid $1 per acre, the solar company might come back to you and say, we need to go smaller for whatever reason, and that might put you below your baseline economics. If you put a minimum leased acreage in there, then you'll still be making as much money as you need to meet your goal. If they end up using less acreage than ultimately what that leased acreage is. But overall, unfortunately in Colorado, solar economics, especially on small scales, are very, very tight right now. So it's important to be mindful and not negotiate yourself out of a deal. You might be in a position of, I don't want to say losing the battle to win the war kind of thing, but you're only receiving your lease payments as the project goes forward. And it's important to make sure that you're having a fair lease rate as well, so that the project can go forward and sustain itself longer term. But overall, be smart and be careful. If you feel like you want to or need to hire an attorney for this, or you have a good relationship with one, then please lean on them. But ultimately, this should be a partnership, and know that you can advocate for yourself and should advocate for yourself. And please don't be silent in these conversations. So I think actually, Austin and Jordan did a great job of covering even some of these soil impacts during construction. So I'll just show you a quick case study of when these things go well, what these can look like. This is a project based in Massachusetts where Hyperion Systems, the company I work for, is based out of. This is a commercial broccoli farm. So these solar arrays are they're single axis trackers. They're 10 feet off the ground, and they're 10 feet off the ground because the state incentivizes them to be lofted higher off the ground. But you can see here, even with some conventional farming practices and his machinery, he can operate within this solar array. And he can even grow a very viable crop. So they just finished their third growing season in 2025. The first 2 years they planted broccoli. For disease prevention reasons, they rotated that crop last year and actually, to my surprise, frankly, grew a viable sweet corn crop within their solar array. I honestly did not expect that, but Massachusetts, and Ian, you can probably know even better than me. I think it was what, 37 days of over 90-degree weather this year in Massachusetts. And so that's uncharacteristic for them. And so the partial shading from the solar array enabled that corn to actually be very viable. And it was comparable actually to the corn that was grown outside of the solar array. So he had a marketable crop from that this year. So how much time do I have? 3 minutes? Okay, great. Then I'll actually just cut it there and let's get into the Q&A stuff. But here's my contact info if you want to reach out. Happy to talk numbers. Yeah. What questions do y'all have? Yes.
For those leasing conversations for landowners, what, if any, like suggestions do you have to differentiate between like that development versus construction versus operations period? Like, what tips or tricks do you have for kind of negotiation wiggle room between those three parts of the process?
That's a good question. So what Andrew's getting at here too is that in reality, I was talking about one lease throughout the course of the lifetime of the solar array, there's going to be a few different stages, and this lease agreement will look a little differently. So when you're first working with a solar developer, they will most likely sign what's called a lease option agreement, which is essentially saying that you'll negotiate all the lease terms at that time as well, but essentially there is a fee for as the solar developer will pay you lower than the lease rate as they're going through the process of getting the approvals from the utilities, getting approvals from the local government for permits and everything like that. So I would expect that the flow of this is that early in the state life cycle, you'll still be receiving some money, but it'll be much smaller than those lease payments I showed a second ago. When the project gets to construction, that will typically up the fee a little bit as well. And then operations, that's when you're receiving the full lease rate. I think that it is a give and take. It's hard to answer that question definitively, but ultimately the solar developer, whoever's owning the project, is taking a lot of risk, as we showed earlier, about trying to get all this project through all the approvals, and they're making significant investments along the way. So if the balance of how you receive that money is a little bit backloaded, so it's more heavy with that lease payment once things are operational, that will just be more advantageous for being a partner to the solar company. However, there's not necessarily a playbook for that or a certain rate that things must do, but just kind of be aware of that balance of if your lease option payments are so large during the development term, during the construction term, that the solar company needs to start making decisions about whether they keep pushing forward through the next stage in the process. Just the lower those payments are, the easier it is for them to make that decision. But at the same time, it's important to make sure you're getting paid fairly for that time as well. Yes.
We have a question online. In each solar model, what are the ongoing or recurring costs associated with each? Depending on these, will it impact your payback period?
The cost of what?
The cost of the different solar models. Like, what are the ongoing costs of once they're developed?
Yeah, I assume that's with the different business models. Yeah, so the larger systems at scale, I've seen from anywhere from in solar, we think about things in terms of dollars per watt, essentially how much money per power can be generated there. I've seen those for anywhere from $1.10 per watt to $1.70 per watt at that scale. That would convert to roughly $200,000 to $350,000 per acre or so, give or take. But those are for systems that are, roughly chest height, and then when they're at their maximum tilt, they're maybe knee level height. Those systems. So as you start adding every additional foot you add in materials cost, I've seen that adds about 2.5 cents a watt to your steel cost for every additional foot you're getting. And that's because it's every foot above ground, like Jordan mentioned, is a foot below ground as well. So you're every foot above ground, you're actually adding 2 feet of steel. Materials cost, I've seen that go about 2.5 cents a watt. Which would be the equivalent of, I think, about $125,000 per acre, if I'm doing my math right in my head. The other thing too, though, is it's not just materials cost. There's also a threshold that once you get above 6 feet, suddenly your labor cost jumps a lot, and that's when it's a little bit counterintuitive, a little bit sneaky. And that's because there are OSHA safety precautions for working at high heights, and that's defined at about 6 feet tall. So for fall protection requirements, that suddenly means you need to put another person on site to hold ladders and things. People are clipping in and out of harnesses, that adds time. And so at Hyperion Systems, like that project that was about 10 feet high, we've seen about it even as up to about a 20% labor cost increase compared to building below 6 feet. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Regarding the economics for a farmer, maybe a tenant farmer, that wasn't mentioned yet. Did you have any information about another line of income coming into farm operation?
Great question. Yes, and that is something we didn't cover in this. That there might be actually 3 parties involved. You have the solar company and the landowner, which we've already talked about, but the farmer is not always the landowner. What happens in that situation? It's honestly, there's no consensus in the industry about how that happens, but there's a couple ways I've seen that tenant farmer relationship can work. One is that, the solar arrays, if these aren't even agrivoltaics, solar arrays have a budget for maintaining vegetation, essentially making sure that things aren't growing up above the height of the solar panel, shading solar panels, making sure weeds don't get too out of control. And so that's one way essentially that these projects can have a budget to support that farmer, is providing essentially vegetation management services. The nature of agriculture will take care of a lot of that, but it's important as well, if you're a tenant farmer, to make sure you fully understand the scope of, am I truly just farming as usual, or am I having to do things that are maybe a little bit above and beyond what I would normally do? Like, do I have to maintain the fence perimeter? Do I have to maintain the area between the posts if I'm not able to grow between the posts? Who's responsible for things like that? And the solar company, their preference will be for you to be able to take care of all of it, because solar installations don't have on-site staff. They are visited maybe once a month or every few months by their staff, but if you have someone on site there, you can be very, very advantageous to them. And another advantage for the solar company as well, of having you out there, is that you can also help spot problems before they become big problems. So if you notice that maybe one of the trackers isn't following the sun anymore, you can clue them into that in advance. And so there might be some, bargaining power, I guess I can say, for upping your fee to be able to receive that. So vegetation management is probably the biggest way I've seen that. Sometimes though, I've even seen that there's some kind of agreement between the landowner and the farmer specifically, where maybe it's a free lease. That's probably the one I've seen most commonly. But that way it's helping the farmer's economics as well by just avoiding that cost.
Yes, so clarification to the online question is not necessarily the cost of putting in the different solar models, but the cost of what you were saying of maintaining solar. So those repairs, the fences, like, have you seen some like big costs that have happened after a solar model has been put in, and there's been something that's happened, and that's up to the farmer to repair it?
Yeah, the only time that it would be up to the farmer to repair is if the farmer owns the system. The risk of maintenance and operating failures is on whoever owns the solar project itself. And there are a lot of companies around the country that provide, these services. They can monitor how your production is looking. They go out there preventatively and do things like lube any gears in the motors. And they don't usually clean the solar panels. That's often already taken care of by rain and snow and small hail already, but they'll do certain things to make sure that the project is going to function well. If there's a major mechanical failure, a major part breaks, that's the solar company's responsibility. And through their financing agreements, they're typically required to put at least 6 months of budget aside so that they can fix things like that and have equipment or have financial reserve accounts to cover those costs. So yeah, very rarely would the farmer have to pay those unless the farmer is the owner of the solar array. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'm taking one more question online. Are there different financial models for adding agrivoltaics to an already operating solar site, to an already existing solar site? Are there financial models to determine if you can modify that?
That's a great question. I assume you're asking for specific tools that are out there. Yeah, so I think that is coming soon. I think that the National Laboratory of the Rockies, that ATOM tool that Jordan presented will have a lot of capability for people to explore the economics of agrivoltaics versus just regular agriculture as well as regular solar. I've been advising on that project as a consultant to try to help make sure we can think about things like that. I will admit we didn't come at it from the lens of essentially retrofitting an existing solar site for agrivoltaics, but I would imagine that you can, since they're forecasted budgets, I imagine that you can still enter your numbers in there and explore that way and see what your operating costs will look like over time. It might be a little bit, may require some math done outside the tool a little bit, but I think that it can be repurposed for using that. So I recommend pointing towards the add-on tool, which Jordan said that would be launched this summer, right? Yeah, so coming soon.
And that one was by, NRL.
Yes,